I've got the walking clothes and the stick back again today. You know, last week we were down around the Sea of Galilee in the northwestern area around that. And so this week we're going to be traveling north, and we'll be traveling up toward the Israel-Lebanon border. That's where we'll be making our hike. And we will be carrying on from there, making some other hikes following that, because we've got two chapters we'll be working in. One is chapter 16, where you see Jesus taking his disciples and talking to them around the Caesarea Philippi area. And Caesarea Philippi is about 25 to 30 miles or so north of where we were last week. So if you can see on the map, you know we were down here in the Sea of Galilee up on the northwestern side, you recall. And we're making a run now. You can follow the Jordan River kind of north, and you see another big lake area around Kadesh, and then you go up, follow the headwater rivers then toward Banias and Caesarea Philippi. And then beyond that, northeast of there is Mount Hermon, which is a really tall mountain, over 9,000 feet. We have some walking to do to get from the Sea of Galilee up to Caesarea Philippi, about 25, 30 miles, so that's part of it. And then in chapter 17, the Bible says that there is a mountain where this transfiguration took place, but the Bible does not identify what that mountain is. So there are many scholars who believe that it's down south where you see the red arrow, and that is Mount Tabor. There are other scholars that say, no, while they were up at Caesarea Philippi, let's just stay there and we will make the hike to Mount Hermon. And that's where the transfiguration took place. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But there are some that go one way to Tabor and others that go to Mount Hermon. And if they were to make that walk from Caesarea Philippi down to Mount Tabor, that's about 60 miles. So we'd have to walk even further. And so there could be a couple of hikes that we've got going on today, whether it's Hermon or Caesarea Philippi or wherever we may be, or down to Mount Tabor. So that's the lay of the land. And if you look at Mount Tabor and then go west of there, you can see that Mount Carmel range and the Kishon River. You remember we were there not long ago, Mount Carmel. So you're beginning to get a sense of where some of the geography is and where some of these towns and mountains are located around this northern part of Israel. So this is a picture of Mount Hermon. These are serious mountains. Has anyone been to Mount Hermon? Okay, Bob's been there. Very good. It's not as easy to move around in some of these northern areas around Caesarea Philippi and up into Mount Hermon. You'll remember the war that took place back in 1967, where the Israelis and the Syrians had a scrap, and the Golan Heights became a contentious point at that area. So when you move around up into Caesarea Philippi, not as many people go. I remember last week when I asked for a show of hands for the mountain that we were on for the Beatitudes, half the class put their hands up. Today we have one that's been up in that northern area around that. Other than, of course, Maha. We won't forget about Maha. We will not forget. Trust me. Trust me, we will not do that. So this is a great picture of the area around Mount Hermon, and a beautiful, beautiful area. Now this is Mount Tabor. So if you were to go down to Mount Tabor, you can see it's a very different mountain, isn't it? You've got this, or you got that. Very, very different. And Mount Tabor is only about 1,800 feet high, whereas the mountain in Hermon is well over 9,000 feet. So very, very different. And this one is just kind of pops up out of the plain. Everything else around it is flat land. Anyone been to Tabor? Bev's been there. Okay, great. Did you go to the top? Okay, excellent. So we'll see a picture in just a moment about things that are up on the top of Mount Tabor, but this gives you kind of a feel for it. In the Bible, Mount Tabor is not mentioned in the New Testament. It's not associated with the Mount of Transfiguration. It is just a part of the story that is followed along, where many scholars believe that Mount Tabor is the site of this. And it wasn't until centuries later with Origen and St. Jerome that they put Mount Tabor on the list. But there are many other scholars that believe that Tabor was not the place, that it was up at Mount Hermon. You know, I'll maybe digress here for a second. When the Bible is not specific about something, and it doesn't say Mount Tabor was the place of the Mount of Transfiguration, it leaves that blank. I hope you don't get hung up on details like that. Some people get really concerned. Well, I want to know everything. I want to know every detail. And the Bible just doesn't have all of those details all the time. The Beatitudes, where we were at last week, we have a rough idea where it was because it was in that area along the lake. It said the Sea of Galilee, but we don't know exactly where it was. Same thing with Tabor. So don't get too disturbed about people claiming that it's Tabor or wherever it might be, or other things in the Bible where there are gaps. It's not significant to the story. If it was significant, it would be in there. But it's not important that it took place on a particular mountain at a particular GPS location. That's not the point of the story. The point of the story is what took place at that event on that mountain. So this particular picture was done in the end of the 1800s. And you'll notice no development whatsoever, and we'll see another picture of Tabor of what it looks like today. It's very, very different. But the significance here, I mentioned that Tabor was not mentioned in the New Testament. The Old Testament does have two listings of Mount Tabor, so it is a biblical site. In Joshua, when they had made their way over to the land of Canaan, they were divvying up the locations for all of the 12 tribes, and they were laying out landmarks. Here is this river. Your boundary goes to this river, and the next clan, the next tribe takes the other side of that river. Or here's a mountain, and it gives you a spot to say, your clan has these boundaries. And so Joshua laid out for the tribe of Issachar, including the Kishon Valley and Tabor. So it was mentioned at that place to just give a land for the land of Canaan. And then flipping a couple of pages over from that in Judges, you recall when we studied Judges, you remember the judge Deborah? Remember her? And you remember that she had an army captain, a commander called Barak, you recall? And if you read that story in Judges, you will see Tabor show up again. The reason is that Deborah said, I want you to wipe out the Canaanites. And Barak said, well, I'm a little nervous about that. I'm only going to go if you, Deborah, the judge, go with me. And she said, okay, I'll go, but you're not going to get the credit for that if I have to go with you and hold your hand. They went to Tabor because everything around Tabor is flat as this floor right here. But you have this 1900 feet where you can see from all sides. That's a great advantage in the military, isn't it? To be able to see all of your enemies coming from miles and miles around. And so Judges then goes on to say that Barak and his army were on top of Tabor. When they saw the other army from the Canaanites coming down, they came down the mountain and they wiped out the Canaanites. So that's the other significance of Tabor that's in the Bible. So let's talk just for a moment about Caesarea Philippi, because that's what is in Matthew 16. And we'll set the stage on this just for a moment, and then we have a special guest with us today that we will talk some more and fill in some of the gaps. So if you look in Matthew 16, and in verse 13, which is where our text comes from, Matthew says, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? Now, he has all of his disciples with him at this point. And Jesus is getting very close to be able to make a transition from his public ministry, going out in the community, the miracles, the teaching, and so forth. And he's making a transition at this point in Matthew to focusing on his disciples, to get them ready for when Jesus makes that final walk down to Jerusalem and then he's crucified. He wants to make sure the disciples are fully prepared and they're ready to go when that time comes. So he's now pulled them away after all the crowds in the first part of Matthew, and he says, who do people say the Son of Man is? I want you to know, you've been watching me, we've been walking together, we've been sharing meals together. You should know something about me. Who do you say I am? And the disciples replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. And then Jesus says, but what about you? That's what the people say. You're hearing the buzz when you're out there and we're around the crowds that we have. That's what they say. What about you? You're my disciples. You're about to carry the torch for me here. Who do you say that I am? And Simon Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus replied, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter. And on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it, and I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Then he warned his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Christ. So we're in Caesarea Philippi. This is one picture of some of the water that's flowing through, and you can see some of the caves back here. And this is just a close-up picture then of those caves where Jesus' disciples were located, and then you can see some Roman ruins, a very old town, Roman occupation there for a long time. But a beautiful area. You can see some of the hillsides in the background. So it kind of gives you a sense of where Jesus was with his disciples, and again around these areas that were carved out of rock. In this area here, this was also a place where one of the pagan gods was worshipped. Pan or Panias was one of the pagan gods that was worshipped, and so the background on the story is that Jesus was taking his disciples there, making a contrast between what Jesus is doing, restoring the world and bringing the world back to himself, and what they will be encountering after Jesus is crucified, where they will be going out and they will be encountering gods and goddesses in these communities and talking about Jesus Christ and his salvation to restore people from the pagan gods that they serve. So this was the background of where he was, giving them this feeling of the time is coming near and you need to be prepared for what Satan is going to be doing, and these pagan gods will be pushing back on your ministry of what you'll be doing. So it does give you a good feel for where we are at Caesarea Philippi. And I'll mention something else that I think is important out of the text, because it does seem a little confusing where Jesus is asking Simon and the disciples, "Who am I?" And Jesus then says, "Blessed are you, Simon, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades." In other words, these pagan gods that they're looking at these cliff areas, they will not prevail against you. So take heart. I will be with you. The Spirit will be with you. And so when you encounter these pagan gods and goddesses, they will not prevail. And Peter, because you were forceful and it was revealed to you by the Spirit that he was the Christ, and I'm going to build my church on you. Now, Christ is the foundation of the church. He's the cornerstone. But we're seeing here in this passage that Peter and the other disciples will then become stones, if you will, within that foundation of the church. And then we come along later and we become part of that foundation and stones in the church as well. Jesus is the foundation. Peter and the others will become part of that church, and that's what he died for. It was for the church. Not a denomination, but the church universal. And all of the people who will be joining that church as they become believers in Jesus Christ. And so then at the end it says, then he warned his disciples not to tell anybody that he was the Christ. That seems confusing. I'm going to reveal all of this to you, but be quiet. Jesus, again, was coming toward the end of this public ministry, but there were a lot of people who still didn't understand who he was. We started this part of Matthew by Jesus asking the question, well, who do people say that I am? Well, John the Baptist, could be Jeremiah, could be this, could be that. So people don't fully understand who he is yet. And Jesus is not ready yet to fully reveal to the crowds what's going to be taking place. But he gave the disciples a little glimpse of what's going to be taking place, that he will be moving forward, and we'll see that as we conclude this chapter 16 of the suffering and the death he'll have on the cross, which is not at all what the people were looking for when they were looking at a Messiah. Some of your Bibles may say, when he talks about Christ, that it may say Messiah. And that, I think, gives a little bit clearer picture of what Jesus is talking about when he says, don't tell anyone that he was the Christ, that there really is a picture of the Messiah. So in 21, it says, from that time on. So from that moment on, we're making a transition now from the public ministry to the final days. So from that time on, Jesus began to explain to the disciples that he must go to Jerusalem, suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, teachers of the law, and that he must be killed. So you can see that Jesus is filling in some gaps here for us on why the disciples not to tell anybody, because he's got to make his trip down to Jerusalem where he's going to suffer, and then this real big bombshell that he is going to be killed. If you are the Jewish people and you are looking for a Messiah, this is not what the Messiah is supposed to look like. The Messiah is supposed to be somebody who's powerful, who can rule over all, who can wipe out these mean, evil Romans and restore Israel back to its rightful place again. And if this Messiah is able to be killed and suffer, then we have a very confusing picture here in their minds about what is going to take place. I have a picture of the Messiah in my mind. You're talking about suffering and being killed. That does not go along with what I'm thinking. And so there's a real challenge for the people, these disciples here, on trying to figure out, well, what's going on here? And I think that's why Jesus set it up initially saying, okay, who do the people say I am? Who do you say I am? Because now he's going to let them know that there's suffering and there's death that's going to follow, and that does not fit the program at all. Now, there is a great thing that he does in verse 21, because he ends that by saying, I must be killed, but on the third day I'll be raised to life. So that's the hope that they have. I think they listen more to the suffering and the death than they did the last part of the sentence. But Jesus is saying, you don't understand yet the full picture. And I don't want to spend my time in the last days that I have here when people ask whatever they're going to ask about, heal my son, take away this disease that I have, and all the explanations and the teaching he's going to have. He doesn't want to go down the rabbit hole of then trying to explain the suffering, the death, and all of the other things that are coming to bear in a short order as he gets to Jerusalem. And so he's saying, let's just be quiet about this for right now. You don't fully understand it. The people out there are certainly not going to understand it. And all we're going to do is get ourselves into a debate when I go talk to people about the Messiah, what the Messiah looks like, overthrow the Romans, and all of this, when his message is not overthrowing the Romans and all the others. His message is salvation through Jesus Christ. And if we get distracted off on these other things, my message gets ruined and distorted, and I'm spending my time in places that I don't want to go. There is time for that. That will come, but not now. So let's just keep this among ourselves. I want you as disciples to know what's happening, because you need to know, because you're the ones that will be carrying the flag. So then Peter took him aside in verse 22, and he began to rebuke him. Just a moment ago, Jesus said, well, who am I? And Peter says, you are the Christ. Wonderful, wonderful explanation by Peter. He's all on board. And now the living God who's standing in front of him, Peter's going to chew him out. I don't know, that's kind of brave, but that's Peter. I think that's Peter. He's just kind of one of those guys. It just comes out of his mouth, and there it is. And Peter says, never, Lord, this shall never happen to you. And Jesus turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You're a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men. Can you get a sense again of this picture of Messiah? The things of men are overthrowing the bad rulers, restoring our land, giving us our rightful place back again. And Jesus is saying that's what men and women think, because we want to have things the way we want to have it. But you're not thinking that way, Peter. You just said, I'm the Christ. But now you're saying, no, I don't want you to go and fulfill the purpose for which you came. Why did he come? He came to go to the cross. And so Peter is saying, no, you don't want to go to the cross. Christ is saying, I've got to go to the cross. And if you are standing in my way, and you are becoming a stumbling block, a roadblock to me, then you need to move out of the way and get behind me so I can go on down the road. Because this is where I need to go. And Peter, you need to come on board. Do you see the picture there? And so Peter then gets set straight again about getting into the mind of the things of God and not the things of man. And Jesus closes this out, and he says to the disciples, if anyone would come after me, must deny himself, take up the cross, and follow me. So they've just heard that Jesus is going to be killed and raised again, but I think their minds listened to the suffer part. And he said, now, if anyone wants to come after me, disciples, remember this is just his small group there he's talking to, if you want to come after me, you must deny yourself, and you're going to take up your cross. And now the disciples are hearing, well, wait a minute. I wasn't sure about this suffering and death for you, and now you're saying I've got to take up my cross, which means I'm going to suffer and die as well? This is a sobering moment for them, isn't it? They've really got to think about what they've gotten themselves into. And Jesus says, for whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me will find it. And what good will it be for a man if he gains the whole world yet forfeits its soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what he has done. I tell you the truth, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. I think this is him talking about the some will not taste death before they see the Son of Man. This leads us right into chapter 17, which is the Mount of Transfiguration. that there are some standing there, some of his disciples, who will see what Christ is going to look like after his resurrection. And so there'll be some that will see that, and we do. We see 3 disciples in chapter 17 that go to that Mount of Transfiguration. But I think the disciples have had a reset on what they thought was happening. Up to this point, it's been great. People are being healed, crowds by the thousands. It's just a wonderful experience to be around Jesus. And all of a sudden, he pulls them aside, and he said, okay, we need to talk. And you need to be very clear about what we're doing here. It's not the miracles, it's not all the crowds, it's not feeding people and all of that kind of stuff. We have serious business we're going to talk about. I need to know that you all are all in, because you're going to be following the same path that I'm following. Are you in? So that's where we'll stop for right now in chapter 16 before we go to the Mount of Transfiguration. Before we take the next step, I do want to bring Abby in on this. Come back from hiding behind her weaving back there. She's come a long way, hasn't she? So Abby, if you can kind of give us a feel, because you filled in a lot of stuff on where you are.
Okay, so there have been a couple of questions as to what the meaning of our mountains are. So let's do a quick refresher, okay? So we have 6 mountains that we're working on. I'm beginning the 5th one here today. So this is going to be our Tabor, right? And we're assuming that there is a pretty cool event fixing to happen on the top of this mountain. Something no one has seen before. It blows the minds of the disciples. And I'm not going to say any more because I'm already spoiling it, right? You've never heard this story. So, okay, so for these other mountains, we have the Phylon Hills where the Beatitudes, Jesus shares a promise, some hope, that if you are meek in spirit, you will, and if you are humble, and if you are poor, and if you are destitute, you will have life and have it more abundantly in various ways. So here's our hope, our symbol of hope, the color blue. Then we have the next hill up, and this is where the prophets, was it Elijah, met with the prophets, and they had their 2 altars, and the Baal, the prophets were praying to Baal and getting crazy and just tearing themselves and cutting themselves, and nothing happened. And Elijah says, "You're on, God," and he zaps it, and everything blows up, and fire, and all of this, and everything burns up. So we have red to symbolize the fire, the power of God. So we've got promise, we've got power. This is our first mountain that we did this.
Sinai, down in Egypt. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we have where Moses met God at the top of the mountain. So we've got a white symbol of purity and glory. Then this is where Abraham and Isaac made their way to the top of the mountain, and God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son. But then, the very last possible moment, in this bush, that's what this symbolizes, the bush, where the ram was, his antlers were called, but he was stuck in this bush, and he becomes a sacrifice. So, each one of these is a lesson to the people that were characters in that story, but also to us. And they're modeling a faithful practice of obedience and learning, and where God's promise is for us as it was to them in those moments. So today we've got the yellow, which is going to be symbolic of another dimension, a glory that has never been seen in that perspective. And then we'll have some color. I'll have a different color green, I believe. But this color was gray last week. And I got home and looked at it and said, oh, no, I don't like that. So we took it all out and redid it. Who knows? That's an artist's prerogative. I have license to do this, and by golly, if it winds up in your home and you don't like it, take it out and redo it yourself. One quick thing, though. I've got 2 new little bits, and I've called these kind of little tchotchkes. I don't really know what to call these. They're not charms. They're little artistic bits. They're symbols. This is a metaphor we've gotten from Dale, bought us a cross. April 1977, the 15th, 1977. Dale, you want to say anything about what this Mountaintop Moment was?
It's the day I accepted Christ and changed my life.
Amen.
That is
Amen.
Perfect. That is perfect. This is beautiful. So he wrote this date. It's not about what he used to write the date. It's not about the cross or what it's made of. It is about a pivotal moment when his life was changed. It's the Mountaintop moment. Mine was in August, I can't remember the date, but I was 16 years old. I don't know if the date, I could work out the math. I'm an artist, I don't do math, okay? I can figure it out. So this is beautiful. Thank you so much, Del, for sharing this. Okay, and then we have, and you really should tell this story. This is really cool. Susan, where are you, Susan? Do you want to come and share this? Okay. Thanks. Appreciate that. Okay. So this is olive wood, and on one of your journeys or travels through Italy, she picked this up at St. Francis of Assisi. It's one of the churches, and it is the last letter in the Hebrew alphabet, which is Tav. It's a mountaintop moment. You being in that place, hearing a story, being in that moment. So we still have we just have a handful of little metaphorical symbols of mountaintop moments. Moments in your life where something drastically changed you. Okay, no pressure, but it would be great to have a few more, and you have another week or so to get those to me if you would like. You don't have to participate if you don't want to, but it would be really cool to have these added into our artwork. So thank you for these, you guys. I really appreciate it, and I think the class does as well.
There you go. Thank you, Abby. Appreciate that. We've got a little bit of a transition here between 16 and 17, and I have asked Maha Tayar to come and speak with us just for a moment about where she grew up, because she grew up right near Caesarea Philippi. So who would be a better person to talk about this area where we are than a person who is from there, whose family is from there, from generations back, and can share a little bit about that area. So I put up here Marjayun, which is just north of Caesarea Philippi. So Maha, if you'd come and share with us a little bit about the area that you are so familiar with.
I'm not a public speaker, and I hope I can express my thoughts through my mouth. I pray. As a child, I grew up in Marjayun, my hometown. These are some of the families that you found out. Mm-hmm. So this is proof that I grew up there. My maiden name is Bayud. My married name is Tayar. And my mother's is right here. And a famous person all of you would know is Dr. DeBecki. His parents came from there. So we like to brag a little bit about people like that. But my precious memories growing up there, as kids we would go and play, and we would find ruins and caves, not knowing that they were precious at the time of Jesus, that he has been to some of them. He used to hide in some caves to run away from the Roman soldiers and the rejection that he had, he and the disciples. My hometown, there's a road that was built by the Roman Empire called the Road of the Prophet. And the reason they say prophet, we were ruled by the Ottoman Empire for so long. To them, to the Muslims, Jesus is a prophet, not the Son of God. So that's why it's called the Road of the Prophet. And that's the road that Jesus took to preach in Sidon and Tyre. But I was very fortunate to grow up in a Christian home. In my hometown, since the disciples and St. Paul came through Caesarea, they were Christians early on, but the majority were Eastern Orthodox. And then I would say probably 50% of the population was Orthodox, some Catholic, and then I was a Protestant in my family, and we were the very minority. So we were picked on, but we were strong and tough, and we survived that. So one of the places that is precious, you showed a picture of the running water. We used to go picnic in one of the rivers called Haspani, and one of the springs of water that fed the Jordan River. So there's so many precious things that surrounded us. Marjayun is built on a hill overlooking Mount Hermon. So every day you look at Mount Hermon to see the sunrise, and what a majestic view, or the moon rising and you see the outline of the mountain. So I'm going to cut it short and just tell you how that holy surrounding affected me growing up, with parents that took me to church every Sunday, believed in prayer, and it just confirmed my belief in Jesus Christ. He saw the same sight that I saw. He saw the sunrise behind Mount Hermon. And that's my treasure in life. When I feel low, when I go through hard times in life, as I go to bed, that's what comes to my mind to keep me calm and with my prayers. So this is the most important thing about seeing all these things, is how it confirms our faith in Jesus Christ. Thank you. Well, this is a picture of the cedars. Lebanon is known for its cedar trees that built the temple. And here I just say how Mount Hermon and all the holiness around us affected me growing up in my faith. Jebel is mountain. Sheikh, the old man with the gray hair, so it's Jebel Sheikh to me. It's Mount Hermon to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Maha. Thank you. And she was going to donate that to Abby as well. It's always great to have an eyewitness from a place, isn't it? Some place that grew up. When Maha told me about this area around Caesarea Philippi and the town that she's from, Marjayun, I didn't know anything about Marjayun. Anyone here been to Marjayun? Yeah, over in Lebanon, Maha has, right? So she's the official source, and so I did what everyone does, which you go on Google and you look for things like Marjayun, what's going on, and first thing I ran across was that listing of the family names. And if you look at, really, I looked at some other Lebanese towns, and they will all come up in Wikipedia showing the listing of all of the family names in that community. And I just thought it was amazing that, sure enough, there she was, Bayud and Tayyar, and then she also mentioned her mother's family name. But a wonderful genealogy of people that have come from those towns, and the history, the generations that have gone before, and what a great lesson from Maha. So thank you for coming and doing that. We appreciate that. Beautiful scenery, though, isn't it, in Mount Hermon? So you can see how many scholars believe that if you're right by Caesarea Philippi and Marjayun, and you're looking right here, would you walk 60 miles to get down to Mount Tabor, or this is in the foothills? I mean, you're already here. The town is there already. So I'm not making a case one way or the other, but I certainly could believe that this through Mount Hermon would be a believable one. And again, the Bible just simply says it was a mountain. So we won't get hung up on that, but what a beautiful scene that the disciples were able to see while they were there with Jesus. Let's move on a little bit. If we want to think about Mount Tabor, you remember just that bare outcropping before that Barak and Deborah would have seen. And now, this is a modern day picture. You can see on the slopes there the houses that are built up. You can see the wonderful crops and the trees growing up on the mountain. So it obviously has been settled now and is a thriving area around Mount Tabor. And again, we're way down south now. We're way down south below the Sea of Galilee and west of the Sea of Galilee. Who's been to Tabor? Is it you, Bev? Okay. So you probably went up here and saw the churches up there. There's two churches, a Catholic church and an Orthodox church. They've claimed that area to say Mount Tabor is where the Transfiguration took place, and we're going to put churches here, and that's your proof. So one of the things you find, I think, when you go into the Holy Land where you're trying to find places where Jesus walked is everybody in every town wants to have an association with that. It would be like, where did George Washington sleep? Well, he slept here and here and here, and every town can claim that and put up a little booth, and you can get tourism to come through. So I don't want to cheapen what's going on here, but it would not be unusual for towns to make a claim for where people have been and where they've gone, and it provides a place for pilgrims to go and make a connection. So beautiful setting up on top, but you can see down below the plain that flattens out, and what a view that Deborah and Barak would have had, or Jesus would have had up here on Mount Tabor, if in fact he was there. So a couple of pictures of art, and then we'll finish up on chapter 17. This was done by Raphael. When Raphael painted this, he died while he was painting this back in the early 1500s. What I read about this was that this painting by Raphael was the most famous painting, many considered the most perfect painting ever done in oil, and that lasted for almost 400 years until the early 1900s. And it was considered just the masterpiece of all masterpieces of oil painting that was ever done. And it was done about a biblical story of the Transfiguration. So Raphael really did a beautiful job on that. A couple of other views of this by other artists who have painted this and what their representation is. You can see the disciples kind of in the right-hand side. This is a watercolor, and then the Transfiguration, the bright light with Elijah and also Moses in the middle. An icon representation. You can see the disciples down below as they're frightened and terrified of what's taking place. And a woodcut of, again, the disciples covering their face because of the brightness. So with a couple minutes left to go, I think we can go through. There's just a few verses here in chapter 17. So we have now left this area around Caesarea Philippi and either gone to Hermon or Tabor. And it says, after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John. So at Caesarea Philippi, we had all of the disciples. All of them heard the message out of chapter 16. And now Jesus is going to take the three that he was closest to, Peter, James, and John, and he's going to show them something else. And it says they went up on a high mountain. This is why some people believe that it's Mount Hermon, because Tabor is only about 1,800 feet, just kind of a bump out there in the plains. But again, we won't get hung up on that, but that's where the idea of the mountain comes along. And they went up there by themselves. The other disciples stayed behind, wherever they were. And there he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. So we have something amazing going on with this transfiguration, and the description by Matthew is his face shone like the sun. His clothes became as white as the light. You get a strong sense from Matthew, and Mark and Luke also have a similar description in their books as well, of this inner light that's coming out. In other words, it's not a light like we have in the room that's shining on us, or if you think about the moon and you're getting reflected light from the sun, this is an internal light that is being generated and is coming out. And that's the sense they have. His face is shining like the sun. His clothes became as white as the light. In fact, when it says, like the sun became as white as the light, I think it was so bright they can't even find words to properly even describe what was going on. It was like this, because that's about as close as I can get as the sun, or it became as white as the light. But this radiance must have been just unbelievable as they saw this change taking place. And then appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Moses representing the law that had come before with the commandments at Mount Sinai, and then Elijah as representing the prophets who had come along. And if you read the Bible, you'll know that the prophets routinely talked about the foretelling of Jesus Christ and his suffering and then his death. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Micah, the list goes on and on. So these two are representing the foundations of the Old Testament, and again, making this change now from the Old Testament under the law and the prophets to the final prophet, which would be Jesus, and him fulfilling then the law. And so these two then are bound up together. I think you take a quick look at Deuteronomy 18, and I'll look at that just real quickly. And the reason is that it gives you, I think, a good picture of what Moses was saying to the people as he was coming to the end of his life and making the handoff to Joshua. And in Deuteronomy 18, Moses says in verse 14, "The nations you will dispossess," this is when you go into Canaan, "listen to those who practice sorcery or divination. But as for you, the Lord your God has not permitted you to do so. the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own brothers, and you must listen to him. For this is what you asked of the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, when you said, let us not hear the voice of the Lord our God, nor see this great fire any more, or we will die. And he goes on to say, Moses says, what they say is good. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will tell them everything I command him. So with that transition with Moses, remember the people were frightened of God, the thunder, the lightning, and so on. And when Moses came down from the mountain, his face was radiating. They said, we can't deal with a God like this. We need someone like you, Moses, to be able to be that mediator between God and man. And Moses is saying, I'm about to leave. But God has it in place where prophets will come along, one after the other, following me to be that mediator between you. And now here we are at the end, the last prophet, and that long chain has come through. And you heard Moses say, you need to listen to him, those prophets. And so then it goes on and it says, Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it's good for us to be here. If you wish, I'll put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. I really like this, but I like that verse more in Mark. If you go to Mark 9 makes a little extra description than what Matthew has. And he says in Mark 9, Peter was so terrified and so frightened, he didn't even know what he was saying. In other words, he was just so frightened, words were just tumbling out. I can't even describe what's happening here with the transfiguration, but I got to say something. And so words just tumble and out they come, and I'm sure he's thinking too, man, I would like to be able to set up some tents and some shelters. We'll just hang out for a while. And we'll cook some food and we'll do a barbecue, and I've got a lot of questions for you, Moses and Elijah. Man, what you did up on Carmel, that was amazing. I got questions. We'll just hang out. We're just going to stay here and be buds for a while. And I like Mark saying it, just the words were tumbling. He was so frightened. And in 5, while he was still speaking, this is in Matthew 17, a bright cloud enveloped them, and a voice from the cloud said, this is my son, whom I love, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. Does this sound like Moses? You will have prophets that will come. You need to listen to them. And here we have this transfiguration taking place. Jesus changing before them. Moses and Elijah was there, and then a cloud comes around. What did the cloud represent back in the Old Testament? The presence of God. He had come down to be with us, and that was his presence. The cloud by day, the fire by night, leading them forward. And now we have this representation again of a cloud enveloping them. God was there. Jesus was here. God was here. And a voice comes out, this is my son. Listen to him. And when the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground terrified, but Jesus came and touched them. Get up, he said, don't be afraid. And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. Isn't that a beautiful picture of Jesus touching them just as he touches us, just as he touched Dale, that salvation story he just shared. He touches us as well. And then Moses and Elijah are now gone. It's just Jesus. We're not looking back anymore to the law, the commandments, and the prophets. This is the one. This is the one. And it was certified by God who was in the cloud that said, this is my son. Listen to him. Listen to him. And then in 9, as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, don't tell anyone what you've seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. This continues on with what we saw back in 16. Be quiet. Don't tell anyone. This transfiguration and all this you've seen, I know it's been unbelievable, and wouldn't you want to say something to somebody? You'd probably run back to the disciples and say, we got to see something you didn't get to see. Let me tell you all about it. And then we'll tell all the other people, look how great we are. The 3 of us were chosen. Jesus says, look, I don't want you to get distracted off on this image of the Messiah taking over the Romans. Whatever you're seeing here, that is not what we're here to talk about. I'm short in my time. We need to focus on making sure that people know that Jesus Christ is the Savior. But he says, don't say anything until when? Until he's been raised from the dead. So when you're raised from the dead, who's in charge then? The disciples. Now they're the ones who are the church and going out. So tell it. Tell that story. But while I am here, as God said, listen to him. Listen to him. The disciples, you'll have your chance. And it won't be long when I'm raised from the dead. Then you can talk about it. And then the disciples asked, why then do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first? To be sure, Elijah comes and will restore all things. But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but have done to him everything they wished. In the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands. And the disciples understood that he was talking to them about John the Baptist. Again, another prophet that came before Jesus, laying the foundation for Christ to come. So the disciples have had an unbelievable experience here with this transfiguration and hearing God in the mountain, seeing Jesus as he really is. They now saw Jesus not as just their friend, a guy who picks up the walking stick and we walk to Caesarea Philippi, then we walk up the mountain of Hermon or Tabor, and then we go to Jerusalem, we do this, that, and the other. They now saw the complete unveiling of God in their presence. Veiled in the flesh, but the inside of Jesus radiating out of God and who he really was. And that's what they saw. And that was the terrifying part of it, that no longer did they see him as just their buddy and just someone that they hung out with and had a wonderful experience with, but they really understood that this was God in the flesh right before them. Well, what a beautiful story. Let's close with a word of prayer. Father, we just thank you so much for Matthew and the other writers that captured this scene of you at Caesarea Philippi, sharing the story with the disciples and then on the mountain. Father, we just thank you that we serve a God who has the power of life and that you were transfigured to show the power that you have to us. And we thank you for being that mediator between God and us. Father, we just ask as we come to you as that mediator that you will strengthen us in all that we do, and that all our work, Father, is to glorify you and to share your wonderful message with others that we meet. And we ask it in your name. Amen. Amen.